like to stand up a little higher. There was a man who bought a mule from a farmer, and he was assured that everything would be okay. Anything he asked the mule to do, the mule would do it. So the man started home, and right down the road, the mule stopped right in the middle of the road, and he refused to go any further. So the man hurried back to the farmer and said, "This isn't fair. I bought this thing, and you tricked me. He will not go any further." And the farmer didn't say a word. He just picked up a 2x4 and motioned for the man to follow him. When they got to the mule, he hit the mule over the head with the 2x4 and said, "Move." And the mule moved. And the man said, "How did you do that? Why doesn't he do that for me?" "Well," said the farmer, "first of all, you have to get his attention." When we talk about the story of Moses, God certainly got his attention. An attention deficit is nothing new because God has dealt with that since the beginning of time. God has a pocket full of attention-getting techniques. When Moses was called by God, it was different. I'm telling this story because this story was the motivator behind this last 10 years of my journey into ministry. Moses was herding sheep. He had really come from a place of living with the Pharaoh, and now he was out with his father-in-law in the wilderness, and he was tending these dirty sheep. And so he saw this bush that just kept burning and burning and burning. He turned around to look at it, and the bush said, "Moses, Moses." And Moses said, "I'm listening, God." And the voice said, "Take off your sandals because this is holy ground." Now, the place was not holy. This was a hot, dry desert. And tending sheep was not holy because Moses had to keep stepping over the sheep muck, and it was rocky, and he didn't like it at all. And certainly Moses wasn't holy because he was a murderer, and he was a fugitive. He had killed an Egyptian for hurting a Hebrew man, and then he fled off to his father-in-law's house so that he wouldn't be arrested. And so it wasn't the land, and it wasn't Moses who was holy. What was God talking about? Nobody wanted to take their shoes off in this kind of environment. But God knows that the place of holiness does not count on whether somebody is a pure person or whether the environment is clean and pristine. It's holy because God is there. And God said, "I've been listening to my children, and they're oppressed, and their taskmasters are cruel and unrelenting, and I want to convince them, I want to convince Pharaoh to let them go. And don't worry, I'm with you." Well, after that came all the excuses that Moses could think of. First of all, he said, "Why me? Why should I go to Pharaoh, and how do I know that it's really you telling me to do this?" And God said, "You'll know when you worship me on top of the mountain." "But God, nobody could see you. I'd feel so embarrassed if they say, 'Who are you talking about?'" "Tell them that I'm the father of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and tell them that I am, my name is I am. They'll listen to your voice, and together you and the elders of Israel will go and tell Pharaoh, 'We want to take a 3-day trip into the wilderness in order to worship God and to make sacrifices.' And when Pharaoh refuses to do it, I'm going to use my pocket full of miracles so that he knows I am really God, and he will let you go." "But God, what if the Israelites say, We don't believe God told you this. Moses, throw down your staff. And it turned into a snake. Moses, pick up the snake by its tail. And it turned back into a staff. Moses, put your hand inside your cloak. When he took it out, it was leprous. Put your hand back inside your cloak. And his hand was fine. And then God said, and if they don't believe these things, take some water from the river of the Nile and pour it on the ground, and it will become blood. These things should prove to the Israelites that I am God. But God, I've never been an eloquent speaker. I stutter and stammer. And God said, don't worry about it. I created your mouth, and I created the words that you will speak. But if you're really scared, take your brother Aaron with you. He loves to talk. You put the words in his mouth, and he'll say them, and then we will know. Then the next step of the call is go do it. Moses finally had faith that it was God calling him. Now God wanted obedience. So Moses took his staff, and he and his family traveled to Egypt to do as God told them. And you know the rest of the story. Well, if you don't, read Exodus 3, 4, and 5. So that's Moses' story. What is our story? First of all, there is no minor story. Moses certainly wasn't a minor story, but there is no minor story when we're called by God. When we are attentive to God, our mission is anywhere, in our jobs, our relationships, our community, our church, and anywhere where we use our actions and our attitudes in the Spirit of God. Over the past 10 years, I've identified some of my misconceptions of God's call and some of my insights, and I'd like to share these with you. This week I was reading a book called In the Presence of God in the Sanctuary of Women, and I found these same insights. It was so interesting, almost word by word, or down the line. First of all, God uses our experiences to get us to pay attention, just like he did Moses. Now, a burning bush in the desert was not unusual because there was spontaneous combustion in that hot desert that sometimes started a fire. But what was unusual was that it went on and on. And when we're attentive to God, we have experiences that get our attention. If you wrote about your holy ground experiences, I wonder what you would put into that. Did God get your attention when there was a serious illness, when there was a death or a birth, or a camp experience that you want to remember, or a serious walk in the woods, or the breathtaking majesty of the redwood trees, or El Capitan in the Yosemite Park? Sometimes holy ground comes as monumental experiences, but most of the time it comes on ordinary ground. Second, God takes us one step at a time. It's true, some people were catapulted into their ministry, but most of us learn to follow God in incremental steps. When Northern Indiana District licensed me for spiritual direction, I was required to take either seminary or the training and ministry program. And I thoroughly enjoyed the classes in Bible and theology and ministry skills, but I made it clear at the orientation I was not on a track to become a pastor. And then came the year of supervised ministry experience. And somehow the lines of ministry got fuzzier and fuzzier. And finally God moved me to the step of saying, okay, no more excuses. I'm listening, God. Third, God knows our longings and our desires. 10 years ago, all I wanted to know was God personally. And then I longed to express that in some form of ministry. And at some point, I stopped setting up the boundaries. I learned that my longings are doorways to God and are often clues to what my path should be. Fourth, God's assignments and our abilities go hand in hand. Sometimes we're convinced we should say yes to God, and I was convinced as a teenager that if I said yes to God, he would send me where I didn't want to go or ask me to do what I didn't want to do. Some Christians still think that. And it may seem that Moses was forced to say yes when he wanted to say no, but you remember he killed an Egyptian man because he wanted to save a Hebrew brother. And so God's assignment was really kind of an extension of that desire to save his people. When our fears are a barrier, God has what it takes to carry out our assignment. It's puzzling, but only when we know we can't do it can we do it by God's grace and power. Fifth, God continually moves us to that place where we find our truest joy. I think you've heard the quote from Frederick Buechner because David Bibby used to use it a lot. The place God calls you to is the place where your deep gladness and the world's deep hunger meet. My spiritual director saw a lot more ministry potential in me than I could accept, but I found great joy in following the path that God had for me. There were practices like prayer and contemplative scripture reading and meeting with a spiritual director that helped me move from hunger to fulfillment. It is risky to open ourselves to God. The risk isn't that God might wake up. It's that God might awaken us to what he wants. Taking that first step is daring, but God will change us and bring us real contentment. When challenges come, we can be confident that where we are because God has led us there. We can be courageous. Sometimes we try to lead ourselves, and that's always dangerous. It reminds me of the Scottish woman who walked from place to place selling housewares. And when she got to a crossroad, she would throw a stick in the air, and whichever direction the stick was pointing, that's the way she would go. One day, she was found throwing the stick in the air time after time, and someone asked her, "What in the world are you doing?" And she said, "Every time I throw it up, it's pointing to the left, and I want to take the road to the right." So how do we know God is calling us, or what God is calling us to? Actually, taking a job that is good could actually keep us, be a barrier to us for finding the job that is right for us. Annie Dillard, I've tried a number of ways to find out what God is calling me to do, and I think you have too. One I used only once. It was the Gideon method. I wanted to know for sure that God was leading me into spiritual direction training. And so I said to God, you know that we can't afford the tuition for me to go. And so if you provide that amount of tuition by November 1, the deadline, I will know that you are leading me into spiritual direction training. And the money came, and I went. There's another interesting way that I found from Ignatius Loyola, who was the man who started the Jesuits. He says, whenever you're faced with two options, Make a list of the positives and negatives, and I bet you do that. Then you live with one of those for a whole week. And then you live with the other one for a whole week. And if you feel at the end of those 2 weeks a sense of clarity and peace about one of those options, it's a good indicator that that's what you're supposed to do. In the case that it doesn't on either, there's probably a third choice. For me, that sense of peace when I try to make a decision, that's really a good indicator, because God doesn't call us where God can't give us peace. There are some other methods. Sometimes our unrelated strands of experience are kind of saying the same thing to us and bring a sense of direction. Or sometimes we hear the same message, but it's coming from different people and from different places. And we begin to realize, I think God's calling me to do this. Or you know that there are heart people and there are gut people. When my gut tells me that this is the right way, I can count on that. There are some who are called to set apart ministry. And I want you to know that the Shalom team here at church is the place to go, because they're available to help you discern. In fact, right now they are studying a book called Listening Hearts, which is exactly on discernment for called apart ministry when you are feeling called to leadership within the church. And they are the people to see. But any job can be a mission. And there are several that I think of. One is, there was a man who had cerebral palsy, was in the wheelchair all the time, and you would think that he didn't have a ministry. I mean, he had an excuse, but he didn't. He put a box in the foyer of a church that had a slot in the top, had his picture on the side, and he invited people to put their prayer requests into the box. And he said, the only thing that I ask you to do is to tell me what happened. He found his ministry. Sometimes it's something very simple. Someone told me this story, and I know I don't have all the details right, but the story is right. There was a home health nurse, we'll say, whose responsibility was to find respite care for caregivers. For this one patient, she had found somebody to take care of him every night except Wednesday. Now, she went to Bible study on Wednesdays, and she really looked forward to that. But the more she thought about it, she felt like she was called to take care of this man on Wednesday nights. She moved, she did what she felt called to do. Steve Burt says, may our lives be filled with burning bushes so that we come into contact with God and experience holy ground. Let me read that again. May our lives be filled with burning bushes so that we come into contact with God and experience holy ground. Before we sing the closing hymn, I want to read this prayer to you, if you would bow your heads. God, as we enter now into the routine of daily life, let us not neglect the sacred and holy. Let us not be too busy tending our sheep that we are not drawn to the wonder of a burning bush. Everything that God touches is holy and sacred. Every moment that we have breath is holy and sacred. So let us not turn away in fear, but take off our shoes and rejoice. Amen.